The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli is a book that is meant to serve as a manual for rulers on how to govern successfully. Originally published in 1532, The Prince was intended for Lorenzo di Medici as a gift from Machiavelli, who sought after a job in Lorenzo's court. Ultimately, Machiavelli did not get the job, and for a time, The Prince was banned by the Catholic Church. However, despite dying as a failure, after his death, Machiavelli's book would gain continent-wide notoriety and cement him as one of the most important political thinkers in European history. Machiavelli begins by distinguishing between two types of states, monarchies and republics. All human dominions will fall into one of these categories, but in The Prince, Machiavelli examines only monarchies. Furthermore, Machiavelli also notes that every hereditary monarchy is either long-standing or of recent foundation. Long-standing monarchical states with established royal bloodlines have an easier time maintaining sovereignty than monarchies of recent foundation. Aspiring princes who are not of an already established bloodline have an additional barrier to power to overcome. They must first achieve sovereignty before they can worry about maintaining it, whereas established princes only have to worry about maintaining their power. Machiavelli devotes the next several chapters to giving advice for aspiring princes. Beginning with the topic of conquest, he points out that prospective states for conquering may be governed in one of two ways. A state may be governed by a prince and his ministers, as in the case of the Turkish Sultanate, or it may be governed by a prince and his lords or barons, as in the case of France. In the first type of state, the ministers have no ancestral fiefdoms of their own to manage, and focus on doing the will of the prince. In the second type of state, the prince relies upon lords to govern a fief in his name. The lords do answer to the prince, but govern more independently than a minister, and due to their noble ancestry, command the loyalty of their local population. In terms of conquest, the first type of state is more difficult to conquer, but easier to retain once brought to heel. Conversely, the second type of state is easier to conquer, but due to the more fractious structure, is harder to maintain sovereignty over once conquered. A prudent aspiring ruler considers which kind of state he is up against and plans accordingly. Furthermore, once he defeats his enemy, Machiavelli recommends wiping out the bloodline of the previous prince, and not adjusting the tax rate or laws of the conquered state. Eliminating the previous ruler's bloodline cements the aspiring prince's grip on power, while keeping the tax rate unchanged quells the discontent of the people. After discussing the topic of conquest, Machiavelli outlines four broad paths to princehood that an individual of plebeian birth may take. These are 1. Through merit and heroism, 2. Through fortune, 3. Through villainy, and 4. Through popular support. Each path to power comes with its own advantages and hurdles. For example, coming to princehood through meritocratic or heroic means requires a great deal of competency, time, work, and dedication. It is certainly not guaranteed that achieving power will be the end result of one's labors. But if successful, the aspiring prince will, according to Machiavelli, be highly respected and find it easy to maintain his sovereignty due to his competence. The second path, that of coming to power by way of fortune, is the reverse of the previous method. A prince who obtains power through this way will obviously have little trouble getting power, but without going through trial and hardship, he will not cultivate competency, and may likely find it difficult to retain his power. As for coming to power via villainy, using dishonest and callous methods can be useful, but comes with the danger of causing aggrieved nobles or populations to conspire against the prince. Machiavelli argues that what separates successful princes from unsuccessful ones of this stripe is how they employ cruelty. A successful villainous prince commits all his atrocities in one fell swoop, and does not hold back with regards to barbarity. But after the deed is done, he stops and does not continually commit atrocities. Instead, he makes minor gestures of kindness towards the people slowly over time. The result is that he is feared but not hated. Moreover, he does not let the people he inflicted harm upon survive to come back at him and attack him. Wounded men will hate the man who wronged them, and will seek retribution. A dead man cannot, and recognizing this, prudent but malicious rulers will not grant his rivals the chance to strike back. The fourth method, that of coming to power through popular support, carries with it the same danger of resentful rivals conspiring against the prince. Machiavelli specifically points to the nobles as the individuals who present the most danger to princes of this variety. The love of the people is easy to retain, especially if one does not alter their taxes, but the nobility, with their own power and ambitions, should always be at the forefront of the prince's mind, lest he find himself conspired against by them. In the following chapters, Machiavelli discusses mercenaries and what characterizes proper armies. Machiavelli, after observing many conflicts throughout Europe, concluded that mercenaries and auxiliary troops ought not be relied upon by a ruler. It is worth quoting Machiavelli at length, as he writes, "I say, therefore, that the arms by which a prince defends his possessions are either his own, or else mercenaries, or auxiliaries, or mixed. The mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous, and if anyone keeps his state based on the arms of mercenaries, he will never stand firm or sure, as they are disunited, ambitious, without discipline, faithless, bold against friends, cowardly against enemies, they have no fear of God, and keep no faith with men. Ruin is only deferred as long as the assault is postponed. In peace you are despoiled by them, and in war by the enemy. The cause of this is that they have no love or no other motive to keep them in the field beyond a trifling wage, which is not enough to make them die for you. They are quite willing to be your soldiers so long as you do not make war, but when war comes, it is either fly or be off." Similarly, Machiavelli is also not a fan of auxiliary forces, as he writes, "Auxiliary forces, which are the other kind of useless forces, are when one calls on a potentate to come and aid with his troops. These forces may be good in themselves, but they are always dangerous for those who borrow them, for if they lose, you are defeated, and if they conquer, you remain their prisoner." Hence, Machiavelli regards the hierarchy of army composition as being at the lowest a force of purely mercenaries. Next would be an army purely of auxiliaries. Third would be a mixed force of one's own men with mercenaries or auxiliaries. And at the top of Machiavelli's hierarchy is a purely native force. Judging from a cursory look at military history, it is difficult to argue that he is wrong. The next several chapters pivot away from questions of army management and towards how a prince should conduct oneself once sovereignty is achieved. These chapters feature two of Machiavelli's most famous concepts. The first being that it is better to be feared than to be loved, and the second being his analogy of foxes and lions. In chapter 17, Machiavelli poses the question of whether it is better for a ruler to be loved or feared. He argues that ideally, a ruler would be both loved and feared, but admits that it is often such that he can only be one or the other. Famously, Machiavelli writes that it is better to be feared because people can lose their love for their ruler, but it is much harder to break free of fear. However, he does stress that while it is useful to inspire fear, a prince must avoid becoming hated. We will return to this point in greater detail, as Machiavelli continually stresses the importance of not being hated as a ruler. In chapter 18, Machiavelli pens his famous analogy of foxes and lions. Foxes represent cunning, shrewdness, and skill at manipulation, while lions are strong, martial, bold, yet lacking in tactfulness. In Machiavelli's view, a successful prince is capable of imitating the best qualities of both to make up for the deficiencies of the other. As he writes, "A prince, thus being obliged to know well how to act as a beast, must imitate the fox and the lion, for the lion cannot protect himself from snares, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. Those that wish to be only lions do not understand this." In the same chapter, Machiavelli also advocates the use of immoral means for greater ends. In his view, humans are inherently immoral and are willing to sell others out to get ahead themselves. As such, a prince has no obligation to keep his word when the ends justify the means for breaking it. Furthermore, people judge based on outward appearances more than they do based on truth. Ergo, a prince should be outwardly magnanimous, honorable, and godly, but behind closed doors should be willing to break his word and betray other men if it is in his best interest to do so. The key is not doing this publicly in order to avoid being hated by the people. As Machiavelli reiterates throughout the book, Being hated is the worst thing a ruler can be, as it sets himself up for overthrow. But if a ruler projects a good image of himself and avoids stealing the property and women of his people, and of overtaxing them, he can ensure a long and prosperous reign. Approaching the end of the book, Machiavelli discusses advisors and whether or not fate determines reality. Beginning with the former, Machiavelli cautions against surrounding oneself with flatterers. Flatterers will not tell the prince the truth, as they seek only to benefit their own position by way of kissing up to the prince. However, a ruler also cannot allow everyone to speak the truth to him, because in Machiavelli's view, if everyone can speak the truth to the prince, then he loses respect. The key is to only surround oneself with wise and loyal men and permit them to tell the king the truth even when it is not what he wants to hear, but only when the king asks for their input. A wise ruler would frequently ask for their input and act decisively on their counsel. As for everyone else, they must show the ruler proper respect and ought not be able to speak however they please to the prince. Lastly, Machiavelli arrives at the subject of fate. Machiavelli departs from the consensus of his contemporaries who, at least publicly, subscribe to the view of a world in which fate causes events to unfold in particular ways because fortune is determined by God. Machiavelli is not so deterministic, but also does not deny the role of fortune in the rise and fall of princes. Machiavelli gives the analogy of fate being both like a river and a woman. It is like a river because it can flood men's land and cause massive destruction. However, this is not to say that men are completely powerless against the whims of fate, as they can build dams and houses in such a way as to minimize the negative effects of a flood. He also compares fortune to being like a woman, because men who are willing to master her and conquer her by force are favored more than the men who are indecisive, timid, unconfident, and weak. While Machiavelli himself does not say this, the adage, "Fortune favors the bold," nicely summarizes the point he is making. In conclusion, The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli is worth reading for its realistic and unfiltered advice pertaining to power. The fact that the Catholic Church banned it for not adhering to Christian morals ought not stop dissidents from reading it. Furthermore, reading Machiavelli will undoubtedly provide insight into the views of other thinkers, such as Vilfredo Pareto and James Burnham, who draw from Machiavelli heavily. Reading The Prince also will, in all likelihood, lead to you becoming a more astute political analyst in our modern world.